A few days ago, the President of the United States threatened to erase an entire civilization from the face of the earth, not in a classified memo, not in a private call, publicly on social media. And the thing is, nobody laughed, because everyone knew he meant it. And then before the clock ran out, something happened that almost no one predicted. And then 12 hours later, it almost fell apart. And then right now, today, as you're watching this, the world may be closer to a new war than at any point in the last 3 decades. Stay with me, because what happened this week is going to change everything, and most people have no idea just how close to the edge we really are. Let's start from the beginning. Not the beginning of this week, the beginning of this war, because to understand what's happening right now, you need to understand how we got here. On February 28, 2026, Israel assassinated Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. That single act, one strike, one man, triggered a chain reaction that the world is still living through. Iran responded with overwhelming force. The United States entered the conflict alongside Israel. For 6 weeks, the Middle East burned. Strikes on Tehran, strikes on Israeli cities, Iranian missiles reaching Gulf states. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes every single day, was closed. Not disrupted, closed. And the global economy began to crack under the pressure. Airlines around the world raised prices. Fuel surcharges hit consumers everywhere. The European Union calculated that the conflict had added approximately $16 billion to the bloc's energy costs, and still, the bombs kept falling. By early April, the war had claimed over 1,500 lives. 57 of the dead were healthcare workers. Entire neighborhoods in Tehran lay in rubble. And still, no end in sight. Then came Tuesday, April 7th, and Tuesday was different. President Trump held a press conference at the White House. He was flanked by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and CIA Director John Ratcliffe. The message was simple, and it was terrifying. Trump said Iran could be, quote, taken out in one night. He said the US had a plan to destroy every bridge and every power plant in Iran by midnight. And then he set a deadline: reopen the Strait of Hormuz by 8 p.m. Eastern Time, or, in his exact words, a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. Read that again. A whole civilization. Gone. That's what the President of the United States said, out loud, to the entire world. Oil markets barely moved, not because traders weren't scared, but because Trump had set and then walked back deadlines before. The question on everyone's lips was, is this real this time, or is this another bluff? The answer came less than 2 hours before the deadline. At roughly 6:10 p.m. Eastern on April 7th, reports began emerging from Pakistan. A deal. A ceasefire, brokered not by the United Nations, not by any traditional mediating power, but by Pakistan. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif announced that both Washington and Tehran had displayed remarkable wisdom and invited delegations to Islamabad. The ceasefire, he said, would take effect immediately, and it would cover Lebanon and elsewhere. Trump went on social media and called it a double-sided ceasefire, adding, and this is Trump, "Big money will be made. This could be the golden age of the Middle East." Iran's Supreme National Security Council declared that nearly all of its war objectives had been achieved. Crowds gathered in Tehran's Engilab Square, waving flags in the streets. In Washington, the White House press secretary called Trump's threat, the one about wiping out a civilization, a very strong threat that led to results. Everyone, it seemed, had won. And then Wednesday came, a day that would change the course of this conflict forever. Because here is the thing about this ceasefire that you need to understand. It was, from the very first hour, built on a contradiction. Iran and Pakistan, as the mediator, both said the ceasefire covered Lebanon, that Israeli strikes on Hezbollah would stop. That was a core condition. Israel said the exact opposite. Prime Minister Netanyahu's office issued a statement within hours of the ceasefire announcement saying the truce did not apply to Lebanon. When Vice President J.D. Vance was asked about this, he called it a legitimate misunderstanding. A misunderstanding over whether a war was going to continue or stop. And then, on Wednesday morning, the Israeli military launched what would later be described as its largest coordinated strike on Lebanon since the conflict resumed. In a 10-minute window, 10 minutes, over 100 airstrikes hit targets across Beirut, the Bekaa Valley, southern Lebanon, the city of Sidon, Mount Lebanon. The Lebanese Health Ministry reported at least 250 dead, over 1,000 injured. Lebanon declared a national day of mourning. The UN Human Rights Commissioner called the carnage nothing short of horrific. The WHO chief said it was operationally unfeasible to evacuate the hospitals. The Strait of Hormuz, which had briefly reopened, the first tankers had just started moving, closed again. Iranian media reported it was 99% sealed. The IRGC Navy announced that all ships must coordinate with Iranian forces before passage or face targeting. Then, Iran launched missiles at Kuwait and the UAE. A fuel storage facility at Kuwait International Airport caught fire after a drone strike. An Iranian ballistic missile struck an oil tanker in Qatari waters. The ceasefire that had lasted less than a day was, by any practical measure, already over. Meanwhile, something else was happening. NATO was fracturing. For weeks, Trump had been demanding that European NATO members send their navies to help keep the Strait of Hormuz open. Most of them refused. He began threatening to withdraw the United States from NATO. The Wall Street Journal reported the administration was considering troop withdrawals from Spain and Germany. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte flew to Washington for emergency talks. After 2 hours in the White House, Rutte told CNN that Trump was clearly disappointed and said, "I can see his point." The former U.S. ambassador to NATO called it the worst crisis the alliance had ever experienced. 70 years of collective security beginning to unspool. J.D. Vance, meanwhile, was in Budapest, campaigning for Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, praising his leadership, attacking the European Union. At the same moment that Iran was firing missiles at Gulf states, the U.S. Vice President was in Hungary, making the case for European illiberalism. This is the world we are now living in. By the end of the week, one more story crystallized how much the world had shifted. American journalist Shelley Kittleson, kidnapped by Kataib Hezbollah, was released. The condition for her freedom: she had to leave Iraq. That's it. No prisoner exchange. The militia named its price, and the world accepted the terms. The most anticipated diplomatic event in years took place over the weekend in Pakistan's capital. The United States and Iran sat down face to face for the first time in over a decade to try to end this war. J.D. Vance led the American delegation alongside Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Iran's delegation was led by Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf and Abbas Araghchi. The talks lasted 21 hours. Several rings of armed forces, police checkpoints, and roadblocks surrounded the hotel. Saudi Arabia's finance minister flew in just to show up. And then it fell apart. Vance walked out to cameras on Sunday and said, "No deal. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement." He said Iran had refused the one demand America considered non-negotiable, a binding commitment to abandon its nuclear weapons program. Vance left Pakistan with a final and best offer. Iran's delegation said the failure lay with the Americans. Among Tehran's conditions, the release of $6 billion in assets and guaranteed rights to nuclear enrichment. The U.S. accepted none. Within hours, Trump went on Fox News and announced that the United States Navy would begin a full blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Effective immediately, the Navy would seek and interdict every vessel in international waters that has paid a toll to Iran. It would begin clearing the mines Iran had laid in the strait. The ceasefire's 2-week clock is now ticking in a room with no one watching it. As of this morning, the most powerful military in history is preparing to blockade a critical waterway. Zoom out and try to hold all of this at once. A war that began with one man in Tehran has touched Kuwait, Qatar, Lebanon, the UAE, Pakistan, Hungary, and NATO. It has closed the Strait of Hormuz, spiked fuel prices globally, killed over 1,500 people, and threatened to unravel the Western alliance. And the man in the White House has now threatened, publicly and without apparent hesitation, to erase an entire civilization and to blockade the world's most critical oil choke point. There is a version of the next 2 weeks where this gets resolved, where someone blinks, where another mediator finds a formula, and the world pulls back from the edge. That version is possible. But there is another version, and that version starts with a blockade, and a country that still wants a nuclear weapon, and an alliance that is being pulled apart from the inside. We will know which version we're in very soon, because Trump said the blockade begins pretty soon. Iran said its hands are on the trigger, and the ceasefire runs out in less than 2 weeks. Whatever happens next, it will not be quiet, and you will want to have understood how we got here. Stay informed, stay watching, because this is not over. Not even close.